Tell me, are you all volunteers or are some of you Olim Khadishim?
It's mostly Mahal volunteers,
Mostly Mahal.
and some of us are Olim.
Half. Okay. And how many are you in your group? What, about 40 people?
Yeah.
Thereabouts? Okay. And at what stage of the game are you folks at the moment? Have you finished your Ulpan and so on?
Most are drafting on this.
Okay. My name is Harold Simon, but I'm known as Smokey Simon. Smokey is a nickname I got in January 1941 during World War II in the South African Air Force. Do most of you, I hope, understand English?
Everybody.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. Well, I'm 97 years of age. I was born in 1920 in South Africa. After I completed my studies, 4 years of study and working at university, I graduated with 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Commerce and Chartered Accountant. And the moment I finished writing my final examination, I signed on for service with the South African Air Force in the war against Nazi Germany. World War II started in September 1939. And as I said, I joined in 1941 after I'd completed my studies. And I served until the end of 1945. I had 5 years in World War II in different theatres of the war. And by the grace of God, I came out alive and unhurt. And after the war, I met my wife, who had also served in the South African Air Force, and she had been trained as a meteorologist. And then we were rehabilitating ourselves. My wife was studying medicine. I set up a small office. After the war, we were rehabilitating ourselves, and we saw the war clouds gathering over Palestine. And I'm sure all of you remember the famous date of the 29th of November 1947, when the United Nations decided on the partition of Palestine. And in that partition, the Jews were going to get 44% of the land, and the Arabs 56% of the land, and the Arabs said, no way, all the land is ours. We realized that war was inevitable. And so my wife and I volunteered to come to Palestine, this was before the declaration of the state, to serve with our brethren in the war that was inevitable. We arrived on the 9th of May 1948, and on the 10th of May we signed on for service with the Israel Air Force, which never really existed. And on the 14th of May, Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel, the establishment of Israel. On that date, the 14th of May, the first Arab army attacked Israel, the Jordanian army. The Jordanian army was also known as the Legion of Jordan, the Jordanian Legion. The officers were British. The British supplied the Jordanian army with its equipment, and they were the first Arab army to attack Israel on Friday, the 14th of May, 1948. And I had the privilege of flying on the very first mission of the Israel Air Force on that date. The army required us to give them a picture of the strength of the Jordanian army, and we did a reconnaissance over Jordan. By the way, I was trained as a navigator bombardier for Bomber Command in the Air Force during World War II. And we flew over Jordan, and we were very deeply concerned when we saw the strength of the Jordanian army. Tanks and armored cars and artillery and trucks and troops. And we gave our report to the General Staff of the IDF, which was then based in Ramat Gan. On the 15th of May, the day afterwards, on the Shabbat, 5 other Arab armies attacked Israel: Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Qaubji's army in the Galilee. Now there was a tremendous imbalance of strength between the Arabs and the Jews. The British had supplied the Egyptians and the Iraqis and the Jordanians. The French had supplied the Syrians and the Iraqis. And so Israel found itself invaded by 6 Arab armies. Egypt alone had 62 frontline combat aircraft. You may not be familiar with the names, but the Spitfire, which was an iconic aircraft in World War II, as well as Italian Macchi aircraft, 62. Israel did not have a single combat aircraft. Israel did not have a single anti-aircraft gun, which meant that the Egyptians were in complete control over the skies of Israel at that time. We had nothing to stop them. You can understand that the situation was really very critical for the state and for the IDF. To add to these problems, there was a United Nations embargo against the export of military equipment to the Middle East. In addition to that, the Americans passed what was known an act which prohibited the sale of military equipment to the Middle East. And we found ourselves being hunted by the American FBI, the CIA, Britain's MI6, Scotland Yard, and then there were United Nations observers all over the place to try and to prevent Israel from getting military equipment. So the situation was really very difficult. The beginning of the war, things went very badly. The one and only road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem was cut off and controlled by the Jordanian army. Jerusalem was under siege. No water, no food, no munitions coming through. The British had handed over the fortress at Latrun. I don't know whether you may be familiar with it, but this was a fortress which really commanded a strategic situation. It controlled the whole area, and there was no way that you could get through to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. The Egyptian Air Force was attacking Israel day after day, especially the Tel Aviv area. Hundreds of people were killed in some of the attacks on the central bus station, for example. They attacked the electricity station. And as I said, Israel did not have a single anti-aircraft gun at that time. The position was that Jerusalem was under siege, the road was cut off. The Egyptians had overrun the kibbutzim in the south of Israel. The kibbutznikim fought like lions. All they had was some mortars and rifles and hand grenades against the Egyptian army, which was equipped with tanks and armored cars and artillery and thousands of troops. Not a single democracy came to Israel's assistance. The American Secretary of State, George Marshall, said that it was a reckless and an irresponsible decision on the part of Ben-Gurion to declare the State of Israel. He stated that Israel would be overrun within 2 weeks. The British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin, who was a rabid anti-Semite, he said in 2 weeks Israel will be crushed. And the Arabs, whose spokesman was Abdul Azam Pasha, who was the Secretary General of the Arab League, he said that if the Zionists dared to declare a state, the massacre that would be unleashed would dwarf what Hitler had done to the Jewish people. On the 15th of May, when the 6 Arab armies attacked Israel, the same Abdul Azam Pasha said, "This is going to be a war of extinction. This will be the end of the Jewish state and the Jewish enterprise." So you can understand that the mood at the time was very somber. A lot of room for anxiety and concern as to what was really going to happen. The Machlniks started coming through to Israel. In all, there were 4,800 Machlniks who came from 59 countries, mainly from the Anglo-Saxon countries, America, South Africa, Britain, Canada. Interestingly, that South Africa, which had a very small Jewish community of 130,000 souls, we had the biggest contingent who volunteered for service in Israel. The Americans had a very serious problem, and that is that their citizenship was at risk. You were not allowed to serve in a foreign army at the risk of losing your citizenship. Fortunately, the government in South Africa closed its eyes to the fact that Jews were leaving South Africa to fight for Israel at the time. Now, amongst the Machaniks, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Machal as an acronym of Mitnarvei Chutz La'aretz, volunteers from abroad. Amongst them were some remarkable men. Mickey Marcus, who had been a colonel in the American Army, and he had a brilliant army record, was actually the first aloof that was appointed in the IDF, aloof general. Unfortunately, he was given the rank after he was tragically killed in an accident. He wrote the manual, the training manual for the IDF. And he was responsible for building what was known as the Burma Road, a secondary road to the main road from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, which, as I said, was cut off by the Jordanian army. Then there was Paul Schulman, who was appointed as chief of the Israel Navy. He had been responsible for buying a number of civilian boats in America, equipping them with some armament, guns and so forth. He was in charge of the Israel Navy. And Ben Dunkelman, a Canadian who was highly decorated in World War II, was appointed in charge of the 7th Division. And these men were really officers of tremendous experience and ability. The Air Force, as I said, really started from scratch. We did not have a single combat aircraft. Our first missions were in small civilian aircraft, Austers and Fairchilds and Bonanzas, where we had the pilot and we had what we called the bomb chucker. I was a bomb chucker. We carried 20 and 25 kilo bombs on our laps, and we came over the Arab positions, and we threw the bombs out, pulled the pins and threw the bombs out. And that's how the Israel Air Force started. Very modestly, very humbly. And we were getting personnel coming to Israel, but we had two tremendous problems. One was how to acquire aircraft. Where do we get them from? There's a United Nations embargo. There's the American Act. There are all the observers and the CIA and the FBI and everybody against Israel. And the second was, when we do get the aircraft, how do we get them to Israel? So those were the two formidable problems facing the IAF. As I said, the war really started on the 14th of May, and on the 15th of May, 6 Arab armies. And on the 29th of May, and this is a date to remember, exactly 2 weeks after the war started, and as had been predicted by the Americans and the British and the Arabs, that Israel would be crushed within 2 weeks. The Egyptians had penetrated into Israel up to Ashdod. Now, those of you who may not be familiar with Ashdod, it's 30 kilometers from Tel Aviv. The Egyptian army with their tanks and their armored cars and their artillery and their trucks and their fuel. And Shimon Avidan, who was in charge of that area of the battlefront, was in a desperate situation. He said that if the Egyptians captured Tel Aviv and occupied the city, where the government of Israel was situated at that time, not in Jerusalem, the government was in Tel Aviv, the war would be over. Exactly 2 weeks, as had been predicted. And on that day, by the grace of the Almighty, Israel acquired its first 4 combat aircraft from Czechoslovakia. I'll tell you presently how we got those aircraft. 4 aircraft were assembled in Israel on that date, the 29th of May 1948, when by all logical standards the war should have been over. And a formation of 4 aircraft attacked the Egyptian army that had reached Ashdod. The leader of the formation was a Mahomet by the name of Lou Leonard. He had been in the Marine Air Force of America during World War II. And in his dive on the Egyptians, he spotted an oil tanker. And he dropped his first bombs on this oil tanker, which exploded and set up a tremendous fire, burning men and equipment right, left, and center. The Egyptians, who had no idea that Israel had acquired these aircraft, were absolutely stunned, that they were completely destabilized. And the Egyptians never proceeded beyond Ashdod. And if ever you travel down to the south by road, at the entrance to Ashdod, you'll see a sign which says Ad Alon, up to here. And that's where the Egyptian army was stopped by the Israeli Air Force on the 29th of May, 1948. The date on which the Americans, the British, and the Arabs predicted that the war would be over. But of course, Israel was still in a very precarious position. How do we acquire more aircraft, and how do we get them to Israel? Now, there were 2 men who, in my humble opinion, were absolutely instrumental in saving our country. Both of them were Americans. Al Schwimmer had been a flight engineer in the American Air Force in World War II. He was a guy who really had vision and courage. He realized that because of the United Nations embargo on Israel, there was no way that we could get equipment by sea or by land. He said the only way is by air. So he set up a team in the United States, and they smuggled out of the United States 11 C-46 huge transport aircraft and 2 C-54 Skymasters and 3 Constellations, all of them huge transport aircraft, and 4 B-17 heavy bombers, which were iconic aircraft in the war against Germany, especially in 1944 and 1945. And how did he get them out of the United States? Especially with a vigorous law against the export of military equipment. he dispersed the aircraft at several bases and aerodromes in the United States. They were then flown to Panama, and then to the Caribbean, and then to Brazil, and then to North Africa, and across North Africa to the Mediterranean, and over the Mediterranean into Europe, and the destination was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was the only country in the world that came to Israel's aid. No democracy came to our help. And so these aircraft landed in Czechoslovakia, and at the time Israel bought 25 fighter aircraft from Czechoslovakia. They were short of dollars, and we were short of equipment. And they sold 25 Czechoslovakian aircraft, which really were modeled on the famous German aircraft in World War II, known as the Me-109, the Messerschmitt 109, which was an excellent German fighter aircraft. And then how do we get these fighter aircraft to Israel? They were disassembled in Czechoslovakia, packed into these large transport aircraft that swimmer had smuggled out of America and flown over to Israel. All this had to be done at night because of the Egyptian fighter aircraft during the day, because these transport aircraft were unarmed. And then they were offloaded in Israel, and they were reassembled in Israel. And as I said, the first 4 aircraft became operational on the 29th of May 1948. That is a landmark date to be remembered in the history of Israel, because the Israel Air Force saved the state of Israel on that date. And so we were getting, slowly, more aircraft were being flown in and assembled. And for example, on the 3rd of June, an Israeli pilot by the name of Modi Alon, a wonderful young man, who at the age of 25 commanded a fighter squadron, and the fighter squadron consisted of veteran pilots from World War II, South African pilots, American, British, Canadian. This young Israeli had such a tremendous personality that these veteran men with years of experience looked upon this guy really as a leader. And this is what I want you young people to bear in mind: the responsibility of leadership. So on the 3rd of June, as we got a few more aircraft, Modi Alon shot down 2 Egyptian bombers that were about to do an attack on Tel Aviv. On the 10th of June, I was involved in an attack on Damascus, a night attack. What had happened was that we borrowed a DC-3 aircraft, a Dakota aircraft that some of you may be familiar with, as a regular transport aircraft. It was owned by 3 Jewish guys from South Africa. And we said, lend us the aircraft for 1 night. And we erased all the civilian markings. And we attacked Damascus with 16 80-kilo bombs. But we didn't have bomb racks on the aircraft. So we used bomb chuckers, guys who manually handle these bombs. We opened the doors of the aircraft and we flew over Damascus and we dropped bombs and we did 6 runs in order to give the Syrians the impression that we had a number of aircraft in the air. We had only one aircraft, which was a civilian aircraft for that purpose. But it had a tremendous psychological effect that a lot of the foreigners who were in Damascus left the city. They realized that the war was now coming to their territory as well. I mentioned that swimmer had smuggled 4 B-17 heavy bombers, 4-engined heavy bombers out of America. One of them was seized by the FBI, and we lost that aircraft. So we were left with 3 of these large bombers. And we decided that on their way from Czechoslovakia to Israel, they would be used as an operational mission. So we attacked 3 targets in Egypt, Cairo, and Rafah, and Gaza. Names which are still in the news day of today. And then we had another famous American guy by the name of Sam Pomerantz. We acquired another 50 Spitfires from the Czechoslovaks. But at that very time, the Czechoslovakian government cancelled the air bridge from Czechoslovakia to Israel, which was a tremendous setback for Israel. Here we have just acquired these wonderful aircraft, ex-World War II, and how do we get them to Israel? Because the air bridge in these big transport aircraft was stopped by the Czechs as a result of pressure put on them by the American and British governments.
Can you explain what an air bridge is?
Pardon?
Can you explain what an air bridge is?
Say again?
An air bridge? Can you explain what that is?
The air bridge, yeah, I'm pleased you raised that point. With these huge transport aircraft, I said they were loaded in Czechoslovakia, they were flown to Israel at night, and that was really the air bridge between Czechoslovakia and Telnov airfield, Telnov base. And as I said, they were loaded up with equipment in Czechoslovakia, they were unloaded in Tel Aviv, and then what we even did was, on their way back to Czechoslovakia, we had bomb chuckers in those transport aircraft with bombs, and as they flew over the Egyptian army, they dropped these bombs again. So we really maximized the use of these aircraft. But then, as I said, American and British pressure stopped this air bridge for political and diplomatic reasons. And Sam Pomerantz, who was a pilot and an aviation engineer, he did something which was absolutely impossible. He stripped these Spitfires by removing their defensive armor and their guns and their cannons and their navigation equipment and their communication equipment and their oxygen cylinders. He left just these shells with the engine and the fuselage and the wings. And he attached fuel tanks under the wings of the aircraft and under the belly of the aircraft and inside the cockpit. And the guys flew these Spitfires, which had a normal endurance of 1.5 hours They flew these aircraft for 6 hours. It was one of the greatest aviation epics in history. The manufacturers of the Spitfire, even after this, said this was impossible, but he achieved it. Now, the war was slowly changing in Israel's favor. By July 1948, the Arab armies had occupied 70% of the area of Israel. But as the IDF was getting stronger and more experienced, with the Machalniks coming through with their experience, with equipment being acquired by the Air Force and the Army and the Navy, the tide of war was changing. And by October, the central Negev was liberated, the Beersheba area, and then the Galil, the lower Galil, the upper Galil, the western Galil were liberated by the 7th Brigade. We had bombed Cairo and Damascus and Amman. The Egyptian flagship, the King Farouk, had been scuttled by Israeli and Machal commandos. The Israeli Air Force was shooting down the Egyptian fighters and attacking the Egyptian airfields, and so the whole balance between the Israeli forces and the Arab forces was changing. The main offensive of the IDF was to drive the Egyptians out of Israel. They were heavily entrenched, and the operational plan was to start this offensive in December 1948. We were hoping to get as many Spitfires over to Israel by that time. Out of the 50 which we had bought, we managed to transfer 22 Spitfire aircraft. So our Air Force at that time was equipped with 24 Spitfires. The Israelis reconstructed 2 Spitfires out of junk which had been left by the Royal Air Force when they evacuated Israel at the end of the British Mandate. So if we go back a few steps and we consider the Holocaust in which 6 million Jews were murdered, the end of the British Mandate on the night of the 14th to 15th May 1948, the declaration of the State of Israel by Ben-Gurion on the 15th of May, and the War of Independence. Those were really the pinnacles of 2,000 years of Jewish history, which was a history of dispersal, a history of oppression, and really a very difficult 2,000-year period for the Jewish people. And here we arrive at a situation where now we are about to really put a major offensive against the Egyptian army to drive them out of the Negev. And that offensive started on the 22nd of December 1948. The Air Force and the Army worked in excellent coordination. We used the same tactics as we used during World War II, where we had a senior Air Force officer attached to the frontline army troops. And he was in communication, radio communication with the Air Force. So whenever there was a change in the situation, he was on the spot to direct the Air Force to get the maximum results. And the effect was that the Egyptians were driven out of Sinai, driven out of Israel into Sinai, and the United Nations then declared that there would be a final ceasefire at 2 p.m. on the 7th of January 1949. And that day, in fact, which was the last day of the fighting in the War of Independence, was a very dramatic day. In the early morning, we had 2 of the Israeli Air Force pilots in the battle zone. And they saw 4 aircraft coming from the Egyptian area, and they tackled these 4 aircraft, and they shot down 3 of them, and the 4th aircraft was shot down by a crew of mechanics who manned a tank. This aircraft was doing low-level reconnaissance, and the tank crew shot it down. And these 4 aircraft never returned to their base. Later in the morning, we had 4 Spitfires in the area, and a formation of 19 aircraft came over from Egypt. 15 Tempests and 4 Spitfires. And then our guys realized this is not the Egyptian Air Force, this is the Royal Air Force of Britain. Israel's not in war with Britain. But they sent over, and I'll explain the diplomatic background to this incident in a moment. Anyhow, our 4 aircraft tackled this formation of 19 aircraft, shot down 1 Tempest, damaged 5, and the Israelis decided to disengage. So what were these British aircraft doing in the battle zone in a war in which Britain was not involved? After World War II, there was what was known as the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, where Britain was responsible for the defense of the Suez Canal. And as a result of that, they had a lot of air bases and aircraft in the Suez Canal area. And when the first 4 aircraft, which were British aircraft that were shot down without our guys knowing they were British aircraft, we thought they were Egyptians. Then we realized that they were British. And that's how Britain became involved. They were concerned that the Israeli forces would drive through the Sinai Peninsula right up to the Suez Canal. And they were responsible for the defense of the Suez Canal. And that's how Britain became involved in the war. So the last day of the war, on the 7th of January, was really a very dramatic day. So, if we have a look at the results, considering the initial overwhelming balance of forces in favor of the Arabs and the precarious situation of the IDF and the Israel Air Force, the fact that Israel had a victory over 6 Arab armies was a near miracle, really of almost biblical proportions. the result of that war was, of course, that we obtained a victory, but we know that the war has not ended up to the present day. We are now talking of the 7th of January 1949, and that war with the Arabs has not ended to the present day. And today, none of us can really know whether there will be another war and maybe a final war to settle this issue once and for all. The Arabs throughout have denied that the Jews are entitled to a state of their own. They claim that this is Arab territory, that we are invaders and we are interlopers. And if you read the constitution of the Fatah and of Hamas, they state clearly, we will never accept the existence of the state of Israel. Never. There's no room for mediation. There's no room for compromise. This is Arab land. And our objective is to extinguish the economic and the political and the cultural characteristics of the Jewish people once and for all. So we don't know whether you guys will be involved in a future war. We don't know. But we do know that the state of the armed forces today in Israel is unbelievable compared to any army in the world. The Israel Air Force today is the envy of all the air forces in the world. Everybody wants to train with the Israel Air Force, the United Nations, and Romania, and Italy, and Greece, and Turkey, because of the expertise that has been built up by our armed forces. Whether that will come into use, we don't know. In my very humble opinion, we haven't settled the lost war with the Arabs. You guys may be involved, and if you are, God be with you. But I'm sure that Israel is going to emerge such a clear victor in the next war that the Arabs will plead for peace with the Jewish people. Just one little humorous story before I leave and invite you for questions. On one of the flights, there were two aircraft, Asa Weizmann, I'm sure all of you remember that name, he became commander of the Israel Air Force, Minister of Defense, President of the State of Israel. He got his wings during World War II from the RAF. But he got his wings towards the end of the war. He didn't have any actual war experience, but he was an outstanding pilot. And he was leading an American pilot who had just arrived on the squadron the day before, and they attacked an Iraqi unit that had penetrated deeply into Israel. And this guy, his aircraft was shot up rather badly. And he realized he wouldn't be able to get back to his base. He wanted to bail out, but he didn't want to bail out over Israel in case the aircraft crashed on a moshav or a kibbutz or a town. So he flew out to sea. And when he reached the shoreline, he bailed out. And he landed safely, a bit shaken up. And then he saw a bunch of kibbutzniks rushing towards him with rifles, because Israel, the Israelis were not aware that the Air Force had just acquired its aircraft. Because the Egyptian aircraft had been attacking Israel for so long that this guy figured they would mistake him for an Egyptian pilot and they would kill him. And he ran towards them, arms raised above his head. He didn't know a word of Hebrew. And in order to identify himself, he kept yelling, Shabbos gefilte fish, Shabbos gefilte fish. And that's how he identified himself as one of the Jewish boys. So I'll end with one sentence. There are 80 Christian countries in the world, and there are about 60 Muslim countries. And there is going to be one Jewish country, the state of Israel, until the end of time. Yisrael Chai.
Amen.
I'm ready for your questions. Don't be shy.
Say it, say
No,
it.
I have a question. So you said that the American FBI and CIA were like preventing arms from going to Israel. Why would they prevent arms from going to Israel if the United States voted for Israel to be a state?
Well, there you have one of these political conundrums. The United States recognized Israel after the state was declared, but they then passed an act which prohibited the sale of any military equipment to the Middle East. Not only to Israel, but to any of the Middle East countries. And in order to back up that decision of the government, the FBI and the CIA, and they were more concerned, strangely enough, about preventing Israel from getting those arms. They knew that the Arab countries had been supplied by the British and by the French. And that was really one of the idiosyncrasies, that they had recognized the state of Israel, and yet they did not come to our aid when we needed it most. In fact, let me make one other remark. You may know that there is a Machal Memorial, which is at Shar Hagai in the Yitzhak Rabin forest. Now, when that memorial was consecrated in 1993, Yitzhak Rabin, he really made a very important statement. He said that the Machal forces really came to aid Israel at the time that we needed them most. He said, you not only gave us your experience, but your lives as well. And the state of Israel and the nation of Israel will always cherish the contribution made by the Machal forces. Ben-Gurion said that the Machal forces were the diaspora's greatest contribution to the survival of the state of Israel. Now, the Machaliks played a threefold role. Firstly, they helped in winning the war. Israel could never have won that war without Machal. Let there be no misunderstanding about that. The Air Force, 95% of the flying crews were Machaliks. There were 426 flying crews in the Air Force. Not all at the same time, unfortunately, but over different periods. Incidentally, out of the 426, there were 92 non-Jewish flyers. 21.6% of the flyers in the aircraft were non-Jewish. In total, there were 168 non-Jews who were amongst the 4,800 Mahmoud. For example, the leader of the French commandos was a non-Jew. Tadi Dufresne, who changed his name to Eitan as a non-brigade during the war, was a non-Jewish guy with tremendous experience. The French Foreign Legion, World War II, and so on. So really we have a very great debt to the non-Jews who helped Israel during the War of Independence. As I said, amongst the Israeli flyers, 92 were non-Jews, 21.6%. So all in all, when you really think of the tremendous odds against Israel, I don't know how many of you folks are religious, but believe me, it was the hand of God that saved Israel. On that 29th of May, 1948, if it hadn't been for the Air Force on that very date, the war would be over and we wouldn't be gathered here today. And so you guys have got a great tradition to follow. The Machaniks who came at the time, as I said, 4,800. And here, I would like to make a remark which I also want you folks to know. In World War II, 1.5 million Jews served in all the armed forces. 550,000 in the American Army, 500,000 in the Russian Army. In the Russian Army, by the way, 200,000 Jews were killed on the Russian front, 200,000. In total, 250,000 Jews were killed in World War II. But as I said, there were 550,000 Jews in American forces, 500,000 in the Russian forces. Then there was the British Commonwealth, the Free French, the Free Polish, the Underground, the Warsaw Ghetto. 1.5 million Jews served in World War II. If there had been 20,000 Machaniks instead of 4,800, there would be no problem today of the West Bank or East Jerusalem. That problem would have been solved. Unfortunately, history doesn't forget. And so we are left with these tremendous problems today. Chaval, but there you are. But when you think that Israel was only going to get, as I mentioned at the beginning, 44% of Eretz Israel, and the Arabs were going to get 56%. And just bear in mind another statistic, that in the Peel Commission in 1937, the Peel Commission was ready to give the Jews 22% and the Arabs 78%, and the Arabs said, "Niet, only 100%. That's the implacable situation which the state of Israel is facing today. And maybe only another war is going to settle this impossible situation. They do not recognize the state of Israel. They tell you that we are going to extinguish Israel, the culture, the people, the economy, and the whole Zionist structure. So I don't want to turn this into a political debate, but I want to give you some food for thought. You guys have got a fine tradition to follow, because you know, not only did the Machanis contribute significantly to winning the war, they helped to lay the foundations of the IDF and the Air Force and the Navy. When I think of the training programs we had in the Air Force after the war, we had these wonderfully experienced pilots from World War II who were training these young Israelis. The first 4 Israelis who got their wings was Moti Hod, who became the commander of the Israeli Air Force in the 6-Day War. The most brilliant campaign in all military history. There was Danny Shapiro, who became a world-famous test pilot, and Tibi Ben Shachar, and another guy. The first 4 Israelis who got their wings in March 1949. They were trained by the Machanis. And that is why Yitzhak Rabin said, the experience that you brought to Israel was of invaluable support to the country. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Sir.
I'm curious about what motivated you to, after serving in World War II, instead of saying, I've done my part and I'm just going to relax and start my life, what motivated you to come here and risk your life again?
I tell you, when I joined the South African Air Force in World War II, I had heard a lot about the treatment of the Jews in Germany during the 1930s. And I developed a passionate hatred of the Germans. Kristallnacht and everything like that. And this was before the Shoah. We didn't know about the Shoah until 1942, and that it only started then. And I felt, as a Jew, I had a responsibility to fight against a country which was at war with the democratic world, and that had decided it was going to obliterate the Jewish nation. It was exactly the same reason why my wife and I volunteered to serve in the Israeli Air Force. Because our brethren, Jewish brethren, were at risk. And our people were at risk, and our country was at risk. And we felt we had something to offer. And that was simply my motivation and my wife's motivation. Fellow Jews, Jewish peoplehood, Jewish brotherhood, however you care to define it, but that was the motivation.
What did you do after the army?
Pardon me?
What did you did after the army?
I was chief of air operations in the Israeli Air Force during the war. And one of the problems after the war was that the Machaniks, whom, as you know, served in World War II and in the War of Independence, they really started going home from about March 1949. And the forces were short of Machaniks to help with training. I agreed to stay on in the Air Force for another year. I was a married man. We had a family at the time because whilst I was flying, we decided not to have a family. And we wanted to come on Aliyah, but we had no money. I'd spent 7.5 years in Air Forces and I didn't earn anything. So we went back to South Africa. We said we're going to come back in 10 years' time on Aliyah. It so happened it worked out to 11 years. But I remained on in the Air Force until October 1950. In 1949, I was asked if I would stay on for another year, and I agreed. And then I was asked if I would stay on for a further year. And then according to the Jewish tradition, we compromised and I stayed on for another 6 months. And then we went back to South Africa, my wife and I. And I went into the life insurance and pension fund business in South Africa. And our plan, as I said, was to come on Aliyah, which we did after 11 years. Both my sons and a grandson were fighter pilots in the Israeli Air Force. At the moment, I only have 2 grandsons in the army. One's in intelligence in the army, and the other guys were the SEALs in the Navy. So, you know, we're still involved in the IDF and so on. And then in Israel, I carried on with the same occupation. And I brought over some interesting knowledge because I worked with a Canadian company in South Africa, the Sun Life of Canada, which was one of the foremost insurance companies. And that was my parnasah. That's how I earned my living. And we came over with our 4 kids in 1962. And now we have 15 grandchildren, 16 great-grandchildren. So we're contributing towards Am Yisrael. And happily I'm still around at the age of 97, and I hope I'll have a couple of useful years ahead.
Thank you.
What do you think about South African-Israeli relations today?
What about
South African-Israeli relations today?
South Africa,
Israeli.
Israel relations? You know, the South African situation is a terribly problematic situation. The government in South Africa is certainly not pro-Israel by any means. We are also looked upon as aggressors, and we have full diplomatic relations with South Africa, but there isn't nearly the equivalent of our relationship with the United States, or with today with India, and with Canada and so forth. And South Africa is not really today a significant player on the world scene.